The living Buddha, when he passed Hong Kong from Shanghai to Burma in 1929, once demonstrated his capability of meditative concentration in the house of a wealthy man in Hong Kong. Speaking of this story, it's quite a stunt. At that time, he lived in a monastery in Hong Kong. The abbot respected the living Buddha very much. In the monastery, there was a Dharma guardian who was the manager of a foreign company, a Cantonese, rich in assets. Although he was rich and willing to give, he had no right knowledge or right view of Buddhism. He just blindly coveted for pleasure. In addition to his original wife, he had 5 other concubines. All of them were fit and beautiful. The equipment in his house and the clothes he wore, everything, including the food arrangement, were completely European style. The architecture is also Western style. They ate with knives and forks instead of chopsticks, and the whole family enjoyed eating live slaughtered animals. When the abbot saw the living conditions in this manager's family, he couldn't bear it. When the living Buddha came to Hong Kong, he had an idea to transform the manager with the cultivating ability of the living Buddha. So he led the living Buddha to see the manager. After meeting this sloppy, mentally deranged, and dirty monk, the manager felt unpleasant. However, his third concubine was a woman who had studied for a few days. She knows how to read and liked to read novels. For old Chinese legends, she was very fond of Qigong living Buddha biography. She saw that the living Buddha's appearance and demeanor were quite like that of monk Qigong, so she had respect and faith in the living Buddha and decided to keep him at home for lunch. She specially cooked vegetarian dishes for the living Buddha herself. When the manager saw his concubine was so attentive, he had no choice but to agree with her. The living Buddha was accustomed to causal circumstances. It is okay for him whether to stay for lunch or not. The abbot who went with him had to go away for some reason and left the living Buddha alone in the house. However, a joke was at the banquet. When the lunch began, he saw that a pair of knives and forks, a porcelain plate were in front of each person on the table. But only a bowl and chopsticks were put in front of him. The living Buddha did not know what those knives and forks were used for. He looked at the small and lovely knives and forks, and picked up the one in front of the manager to play with. Then the manager was furious. The dirty monk actually touched his eating utensils, and he became disgusted at once. Immediately, he put on his face and lectured, "Monk, you monks, no matter where you go, should always be quiet. You came to my house for lunch the first time today. Why do you take things casually, like a monkey with hairy feet and hands? It shows that as a monk, you have no capability of meditative concentration at all." This is absolutely unbearable for ordinary people to hear such a rude lecture. Nonetheless, the living Buddha's mind was totally immovable. After the manager had finished, he said with a smile on his face, "Yes, as a monk, my visions are shallow. I've never seen such things and like to touch with hands without meditative concentration. Then you, a great layman, must have good meditative concentration." The manager didn't reply, and the living Buddha buried his head and ate his meal. When everyone finished their lunch, they all got off the table and left, but the living Buddha did not leave the dining table. Instead, he crossed his legs in place, closed his eyes and meditated. At first, people in this family did not pay attention to him, thinking that he closed his eyes and rested. However, after an hour, he did not get down from his seat, and after another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, he still did not get down from his seat. When dinner was ready, they told him to eat, but he closed his eyes tightly and ignored it accordingly. When his family saw the monk in such a shape, they were baffled. They called him many times, but he still ignored. After dinner, he kept sitting there motionless. When it was time for bed, they called him to go to bed, but he still had no response. They pushed him, and he was immovable. They had no choice but to let him alone. The next morning, his family got up and saw that the living Buddha was sitting there without changing his appearance. The maid brought the breakfast to him and asked him to eat. He still did not say anything and did not move. No matter what they spoke to him, he truthfully held the mantra of shutting mouth, ignored it and did not change his form. When they looked at his appearance, there was no difference. He didn't seem to be sleeping, his two eyes were half open and half closed. Then they listened to his nostrils, and his breathing was also normal. At this time, the manager was confused, angry and anxious, and did not know what to do. Several of his concubines saw the living Buddha sitting there day and night without saying a word, without eating or drinking. They did not know what was wrong with him. If he died in his home, it would be a big trouble. The more they thought about it, the more panicked they became. Among them were two soft-hearted concubines, weeping eagerly. When they are bustling, the abbot came. Because he did not see the living Buddha return to the temple overnight, he came to see him specially. He walked in and looked around at the men and women in the house. All of them were frowning for no reason. When the manager saw the abbot coming, he sighed and stomped his feet and complained. "You've inflicted much suffering on me, master. You bring this monk here and make our family eat and sleep uneasily all day and night." The abbot looked at the living Buddha sitting there as if he was in meditation. There was nothing unusual. He thought there must be a reason for this, so he asked about the situation yesterday. The manager said that the living Buddha was playing with the knife and fork he was eating on the table yesterday, and he spoke a little gossip about the living Buddha. The abbot understood. "Yes. Didn't you say that he is not quiet and has no capability of meditative concentration? That's why he shows a little meditative concentration for you." As soon as he said this, the manager suddenly woke up and was remorseful. Then he immediately prostrated himself and asked the living Buddha for pardon. "I am so foolish and ignorant to offend you. May you not blame me and mercifully forgive me." Several concubines were also prostrated on the ground. Then the living Buddha opened his eyes and gave them a smirk. At that time, the manager was moved by the living Buddha and knelt on the ground and refused to get up. The living Buddha said, "I'm out of meditation now, and you can get up." The manager knelt on the ground and said, "May I ask you to accept me as a disciple, and I will get up." The concubines also asked the living Buddha as their master. The living Buddha said with a laugh, "Good. If you want me to accept you as disciples, I want all the men, women and servants in your family to be my disciples. Will you do it?" When everyone heard the words of the living Buddha, they all came to kneel in front of him with joy. The living Buddha stepped down and touched the top of each head with his soft cotton-like palms. After saying 3 refuges, he said to the manager in a kind manner. As the ancients say, it is difficult for the rich to learn the way. Basically, the rich are arrogant and only covet for pleasure. A quick awakening like you can be regarded as good horses see the shadow of the whip. It is evident that all your family have good roots and affinity for Buddhism. From now on, if you can humbly respect the 3 jewels and do not kill, you will be rewarded with infinite blessings in the present and future lives. In the future, you should honor all monks with the same manner that honors me, and that is the true conversion to the 3 jewels. From then on, the manager never used a knife and fork to eat again, and the whole family became vegetarian, no longer slaughtering live animals, and became a devout Buddhist family. In 1949, I went to Kuanyang from Taiwan and met Master Haishan in Hong Kong. When we were chatting, he told me this story. The living Buddha also revealed the above story when he stayed at Longpa Monastery in Yangon and had a leisure chat with the Chan fellows. They often made fun of him and asked him if he would play with others' knives and forks that used to eat.